Welcome to episode 460. This week, we answer listener questions. First up, did I contradict one of my own sermons from 7 years ago? And then, what happened to the discipleship pipeline that used to carry kids in the church from birth all the way through college? Phil says it's completely blown up, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what does it mean for Christian parents? Then I interviewed Jeff Bilbro about his new book, Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news. We talk about how Christians should think about their media consumption, how the news media is competing with the local church, and what 19th century communication technology like the telegraph can actually teach us about our struggles with 21st century technology like social media. All of that, plus the magical musical armor of Fireflies. But first, today's episode is being brought to you by my latest book, What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer? A visual guide to the spiritual practice most of us get wrong. It's available now, and it's unlike any book on prayer you've seen before. Not only does it avoid making you feel guilty about not praying, it will explain why most of what you've been told about prayer is probably more pagan than Christian. And if that doesn't hook you, then my doodles that illustrate virtually every page probably will. It's the book on prayer for spiritual thinkers and visual learners. So check out What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer today. Okay, on with the show.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I am here with Christian Taylor once again. Hi, Christian.
Hello, Phil.
Hi. And Sky Jitani.
Hi.
Hi. And Jason Rugg, missionary to the cinnamon roll. Hi, Jason.
Hey there.
I think he's a evangelist of the cinnamon roll.
Oh, yeah. He evangelizes cinnamon rolls to us, but he has to go convert them to baked goods before.
At least,
I'm sorry I'm mentioning this so much, but you were tweeting pictures of your cinnamon rolls, and I just couldn't get over it.
Every week or so, I get someone sending me a pan of cinnamon rolls and saying, like, this is your fault. I made these because of you.
Wow. Congratulations. So you're like the Pied Piper of cinnamon rolls. Is it all any other pastries or is that it?
Mainly
Apple
cinnamon-based ones. Yeah, definitely. It has to
Okay.
be cinnamon-based. I'm a big cinnamon guy.
Okay. What if you take the frosting off the top? Are you still there for it or does it fall apart?
Yeah, I would still eat it.
Okay.
So my question is, what's your favorite cinnamon roll?
Okay, so
Most highly rated.
Great.
there's
Cinnabon?
a store in Naperville, Illinois, that's Cinnaholic, and they're actually vegan cinnamon rolls, and they're really good. They're a little doughy, but they're huge. They're like the size of a baseball or bigger. They're like more like a softball, actually. They're really good. Really
I
good.
saw the name Cinnaholic and I thought it was a strip club, so I didn't go in.
Cinnaholic.
Here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian.
Jason, you need to start your own pastry shop. You call it like Rugs Rolls.
I have another animal story. We're going on
I
animal
love those.
here.
Lay it on me.
News of the bug. This is news of the bug. Fireflies wear musical armor to avoid getting eaten by bats.
Interesting. Tell me more.
Category. I know you want to know, right? This is in the category of stories where you just think, isn't creation amazing? Fireflies could wear musical armor to avoid. That sounds like it's from the Smurfs or the My Pretty Pony.
It sounds like a bad Michael Jackson video. Like Captain EO or something.
You somehow made that cynical, and I'm not even sure how. It sounded good until you brought in Michael Jackson. Now my story.
His musical armor.
It sounds like it should be in one of like Cameron's. What's his name? What's his name? Who made the Blue People?
Kirk Cameron.
Who made
Avatar?
James Cameron. James Cameron. It should be in James Cameron's Avatar movies.
I think it's Michael Jackson with his musical armor and his magical codpiece.
Oh my word.
You will not say the word codpiece on the podcast. You are banned. Fireflies, I don't know if you notice this, but bats like to eat flying bugs. You know, that's kind of their thing. They fly and they eat bugs. So it helps if the bugs are also flying, which fireflies are. Fireflies also have little beacons on their butts. This is not news of the butt, it's news of the bug, but they have little beacons, which would make them especially easy to spot. But fireflies don't taste good. They taste bad. They're actually slightly poisonous to insect-eating bats, which doesn't help if the bat doesn't know that until they've eaten you. So, according to Professor Yossi Yavel, and I would love to have a name, both my first and last name start with Y. I was trying to think of what my name could be to have my
Then
initials.
you would be at the end of every graduation ceremony or every
right.
eating chart.
Like Yip and Yancey or Yellow, whatever. It's hard to think of Y names. Not very many Y names in the English.
Yell Yisher.
Yvonne.
That's not real. Yvonne? But it's Yvonne. Okay. According to Yossi Yovel of Tel Aviv University, fireflies may have made a second adaptation besides the blinking butts to try to warn bats that they don't taste good. And this takes advantage of a bat's not particularly secret weapon. So Yossi Yovel came upon this discovery by accident. He says, we were wandering around a tropical forest with microphones capable of recording bats' high frequencies when suddenly, how many days have you spent, Sky, wandering around a tropical forest with microphones capable of recording bats' high frequencies?
0.
Oh, okay.
Not my calling.
I was thinking it'd be at least one. Suddenly, we detected unfamiliar sounds at similar frequencies coming from fireflies. In-depth research showed the fireflies were producing the sound by moving their wings. Further investigation revealed the pitch the fireflies were making was not only inaudible to humans, it was also inaudible to fireflies. So they don't even know they're making this sound. They can't hear it. It doesn't attract other fireflies, but it is in the prime listening region of bats. So it's like a warning beacon to bats. Hey, Christian, someone wants to know if you're ready for lunch. So his theory...
Sorry, that's my sister sister She wants to know
sister
something.
Myra. Hi, Sister Myra. Yavel calls the sound musical armor and believes it is a warning to bats that you don't want to eat the thing that's making this noise because it tastes terrible.
Wait a minute. I don't get that part. How do they know how the bats interpret that sound?
Are you questioning Yavel?
I'm asking. I didn't read the article. I'm hoping it's in there somewhere. Like, they found that these bugs are making this sound that only really the bats can hear, but how do you know that's a deterrent to the bat?
Well, how many bats have you seen eat a lightning bug? I don't know.
They may not be eating the lightning bug because they glow and they know that they taste bad and they're poisonous.
Guess what? The co-author of this study is named Ksenia Kvorachku.
Does everything have to be alliterated or what?
Yavel Yasser and Ksenia Kvorachku. The idea of warning signals that the sender itself cannot detect is known from the world of plants, but is quite rare among animals. That's all.
This is like in the category of things that make you go,
I don't know. I know all kinds of people that send off bad vibes and are unaware of it.
Good one, Sky. Good one.
You're funny. Okay, I just thought that was fascinating because it's one of those other things that's like, that's pretty complex. Could just one or two mutations just make fireflies rub their wings together in such a way to make a noise that only bats can hear, who are one of their predators? Huh?
I still don't see how that necessarily means it's a deterrent to the bats. And couldn't it just be coincidence? Couldn't it be coincidence that the fireflies' wings make a frequency of a certain range? Man. It's not necessarily.
And have they been able to record this? Like, can we really take their word for it? Is there proof?
Guys, this is such a cynical bunch.
I would understand
Jason, are you with me?
Here's the thing. I would understand if the frequency was some kind of cloaking device where it disrupted the bat's radar system, and so they can't really tell where they are, and it makes like a deterrent. Fine, I get it. But I don't know.
Yeah.
It just seems like
means
they're
bats
stretching.
Know exactly where they are so that they can not eat them.
Right. It's weird.
Okay. I thought it was interesting. I don't know.
I liked it.
Magical musical armor. Who wouldn't want magical musical armor?
I
Oh
want
my.
it, and I'm not even a Firefly.
Yeah, I mean, didn't Bilbo give Frodo some magical musical armor?
I would love that armor to deflect all of the negative and hurtful things people say about
That's
me.
so
That would be
nice. That's
lovely.
so nice. All right, we're doing something different today. We're going to answer some questions from listeners. We haven't done that in a while.
Yay.
And questions pile up.
Mailbag.
Sky is bringing his usual enthusiasm to the show.
I'm happy.
I do love mailbag.
Okay, let's get right into this because we get bunches of questions. And so we're going to answer some good ones. We had Derwin Gray on the show last week, week before, no, 2 weeks ago, I guess, as this is coming out. And Liza DeGarmo. Liza, I'm very curious. Are you related to Eddie DeGarmo? If so, stamp your foot twice. I'm not sure what
Of
you can do.
DeGarmo and Key, just for the millennials that don't know.
Of DeGarmo and Key, one of my favorite bands, Christian bands from high school. Hi, Sky and Phil. I so appreciate the work you are doing with Holy Post and have actually referenced you a lot as I teach history at an international missionary kids school. So that's cool. We're referenced in history. I started listening to the podcast with the race video last summer. I started at the beginning of Holy Post and I'm very slowly catching up. So she's listening to the entire library. On one of the podcasts the first year, you talked about a sermon Sky preached about the gospel. Okay, you're following me, Sky? And the way he summed it up was the gospel message is Jesus Christ is Lord. Then he talked about our response to the gospel and the implications of the gospel. On this week's interview with Derwin Gray, Sky talked about Matt Chandler's foreword to Dr. Gray's book, where Matt called multi-ethnic churches an implication of the gospel, but not part of the gospel. Sky took issue with that assessment. However, Liza DeGarmo says, it seems to me the unity in the body and all of its diversity would qualify as an implication rather than fitting into the phrase Jesus Christ is Lord. Could you help me understand that? If the gospel is just the message Jesus Christ is Lord, where in that does it say church bodies have to be multi-ethnic? Sky Jitani.
Okay, a couple things. Number one, I applaud her for going back and listening to all of those old episodes.
Sky, you said something 7 years ago that I think contradicts something you said last week. Let's have it.
That's impressive. Number two, I would encourage her to go back if she can find it on YouTube and actually listen to that sermon because it is on YouTube and people could find it and engage the whole thing. Number three, she's absolutely correct that the summary of the gospel I give is Jesus Christ is Lord. But that's a succinct way of, and it's based in 1 Corinthians 15. And part of the reason I even engage that sermon is because so many people have made discipleship not core to the gospel. In other words, I'm saved by Christ, but to actually live my life under his authority and lordship is secondary or non-essential. So the statement Jesus Christ is Lord or King is a way of saying that he has dominion over everything, which is what gets repeated by Paul over and over and over again in 1 Corinthians 15. He says all things, all things, all things, which is to emphasize Jesus' lordship over all things. So back to Derwin Gray's book and multicultural churches, I think Derwin quite appropriately, based on the New Testament, recognizes that if Jesus Christ is Lord over all things, then all people need to be included in the fellowship of his church, crossing racial barriers and ethnic barriers. And so it is central to the gospel. And Matt Chandler in his foreword talks about, well, it's an implication, which is to imply it's important, but optional. Like it's a great overflow implication of the gospel, but if you don't do it, it's okay. You've not perverted the gospel in any way. That's not what I was saying in my sermon. In fact, I was saying precisely the opposite. If Jesus Christ really is Lord over all things, then nothing can be set aside as unimportant over his domain, over his rule. And so to say that racial reconciliation or multi-ethnic church is good and great, but non-essential is the opposite of what I'm saying by the statement, Jesus Christ is Lord over all things. So, but her perception just on the surface is correct. You'd have to go deeper and hear that whole message of mine to understand why that's not what I was saying.
Right. One of the things that came up in that interview, which was a really good interview, by the way, Sky, good interview with Derwin, was the contrast between the hard work of building a multi-ethnic church
and then the easy work of doing, what was promoted as the homogeneous unit church.
Yeah.
Can you? But no one really unpacked what was that theory, and why is it so easy, and why shouldn't we do what's
Yeah.
easy?
So there were some researchers back in, I don't know, about 1940s or 50s or something, came out of Fuller, that did research on what churches grow most quickly. And the observation they made is that homogeneous congregations grow more rapidly than diverse congregations, which makes sense. It's simply birds of a feather flock together. And if everyone thinks the same, believes the same, looks the same, shares the same culture, shares the same, style of music, it's just, you're going to grow more rapidly. So that was an observation, not a prescription. It was just an observation, and it was known as the homogeneous unit principle. Well, eventually, by the 1970s and 1980s, when the megachurch movement was really going gangbusters, they took this observation of homogeneity grows churches faster, and they made it into a prescription. And they went from just a neutral observation to a positive value, saying if you really care about growing the gospel, if you really care about reaching more people and having a large church, then you should only target one kind of person. And most famously, Willow Creek did this when they talked about unchurched Harry and Mary, which they described as their target audience, and they described them socioeconomically and culturally and all that. And that's who their church was for. And it was all based on, if we just target that person, we're going to grow more quickly. And it's true, you will grow more quickly, but no one stopped to ask, is that really what the New Testament calls us to? Or is there a value other than just rapid growth that we should care about, namely diversity? So that's what Derwin was getting at. The homogeneity does grow churches more rapidly, but it doesn't grow New Testament churches. It grows American churches.
Okay, someone on my Facebook page where I posted that interview was so put out by that statement that the multi-ethnic church is a gospel imperative, that they actually said, I used to respect Sky as an intellectual. So
Okay.
you lost a fan just based on that statement. What would you say about that, Sky? How does that make you feel?
You know what? As Derwin said, sometimes there need to be some divine subtractions, and that's okay. I mean, I think his argument is so absolutely solid. It's irrefutable that in the New Testament, Paul absolutely believed that Jews and Gentiles had to be in one unified congregation. You couldn't have a Jewish church and a Gentile church. And he's simply advancing that same reconciliation through the cross is an imperative in our culture, that where there are social divisions, they are mended in Christ, and we are called to be one. And if you think it's okay to have Jewish churches and Gentile churches in the first century in the New Testament, then I don't know what New Testament you're reading, but it's not the one that we've been given.
Can I ask you a question? Is there anywhere in the Bible where it talks about in heaven it will be all groups of people together? Somehow I remember that, like it was in Revelation or something.
Yeah, Revelation 7 speaks of every people of every nation, language, and tribe around the throne. The interesting thing is that scene is used by advocates of multicultural communities, saying, look, we're all going to be together in heaven. We should all be gathered together in our churches here below. I've also heard that exact same passage of scripture referenced by segregationists who've argued, if we're all going to be separated.
In what way?
They assume that those different groups of people are segregated around the throne in heaven. And they're each...
So there's the black section around the throne, and there's the white section, and there's the Jamaican section, and there's
but where's basis for that?
There isn't a basis.
Where is there basis for that?
It's not there, but it's an assumption, because it doesn't say they're all intermixed. It just says they're all there. You don't know if they're intermixed or if they're segregated. So segregationists assume they're segregated.
You don't know if there are ropes separating the sections. So there's no.
But let me ask you this. Where is the scriptural basis for the races being segregated anywhere?
Right there in Revelation. They're all around the throne, but in separate seating sections.
No, that's not there. We just agreed upon the fact that that's not there.
They're not. It's not. And the whole concept of race doesn't exist in the Bible. There
is Jews and Gentiles.
Yeah, but those aren't races. They are.
Well, then what about those tall Nephthalis? That's a race.
The idea of skin color
Nephilims or whatever they are.
The equation of skin color with race and segregation is a far later, more modern development that it wasn't how people thought of each other in the ancient world.
Well, apparently Jews and Gentiles thought each other that way.
But it wasn't about a skin color. It wasn't about it was about a religious identity. Right. And a heritage of descendant from Abraham, for example. But you could become a Jew who wasn't a biological descendant of Abraham. You could convert into Judaism and be circumcised and become a Jew.
All right, I'm tracking.
Right. So the idea that there are black people and Asian people and European people and those categories did not exist in the ancient world.
Okay. I'm moving on. All right, so we took care of that. So we can still respect Sky's intellectualness, I guess. Dave Oldenkamp says, Dave Oldenkamp says he wants parenting advice. Okay, so I think everyone here is a parent, including the one that has many baby cinnamon rolls crawling around his feet every morning saying, Papa, Papa. Eat me. Dave Oldenkamp says, hey, crew, that was a great episode. I don't know which one he was talking about, but that's okay. My wife and I appreciated the brief discussion about parenting. We would love to hear more from you guys about parenting and maybe some guests. My wife grew up in a pretty stereotypical fundamentalist evangelical homeschool family. Lots of legalism, lots of judgment, lots of, quote, protecting from the world. No explanations, and no grace. We are aware of many of the errors of the previous generation, but also don't feel like we know the right way. We don't want to swing the pendulum too far the other way. Help! Do we have any principles of parenting as you move away from the hyperprotective? I was talking to someone the other day, and when I grew up, I felt like, particularly, actually probably peaked around my generation, that we had developed a really great cradle to adulthood pipeline for evangelical kids, in that you were born right into the nursery at church. You went to Sunday school up until you hit, junior high youth group, and then you hit high school youth group, and then you would be sent to a Christian college. And then, so by the time you could make it from birth to marriage without having a non-Christian friend was basically what we kind of did. And I was part of that. Here's your Christian music when you're ready for music. Here's you want some cool t-shirts to wear? Here's some Christian versions of cool t-shirts to wear. It was this whole pipeline of, you never have to wander out into the world and get sullied. And to me, it feels like for my kids' generation, that pipeline has been destroyed, like just absolutely destroyed. And I don't think there's any saving it. Just the number of kids that, youth sports started taking out Sunday school. And then when we had so many friends at our, public schools, or so many non-Christian friends, it's like, why do I have to just hang out with youth group kids? Because all my other friends are doing this on Friday night, and I don't want the youth group anymore. And then Christian schools are probably appearing to be in decline. So my question is, have we replaced that with anything that has any teeth for parents to hold on to?
Okay, hold on a second,
Sky.
Because I agree that pipeline is completely broken down, but don't you think it was inevitable with the internet anyway? Like, you can't isolate
and was it a
people.
bad thing? Like, I'm sitting here listening to you thinking, I don't necessarily know that that's a bad thing that it's broken down.
Yeah, but here's my question. That pipeline was so secure that parents didn't really have to figure out how to disciple their own children, because there was always a grown-up waiting to hand off your kid to the next grown-up in the line to do that for you. And now that that's breaking down, Why do we do instead? I just wanted to hand them to my church, who would then, pass them bucket brigade style all the way to their marriage night without having their feet touching the dirty ground. So without that, what do we as parents do for our kids? See, you got nothing. You got nothing. I'm going to start with Jason. Jason, go first.
Give up.
No, Jason, you know what, Jason, you are a recently graduated kid.
He was homeschooled, K through 12.
Yep.
You were in that pipeline.
Ish.
I would love to hear your take on what that was like for you and what your thoughts are now.
Yeah. It's interesting because I didn't grow up going to church.
You didn't see this coming, did you?
No, I didn't. I didn't grow up going to church. I started going to church on my own in middle school because I had a friend who his mom worked at the church, and so I went to youth group with him. So I didn't attend Sunday service or anything like that.
Okay.
And it was
so you jumped into the pipeline halfway through.
Yeah, and it was weird. The stuff that I didn't get. It was a very strange way in, but it was a very welcoming way in. It was kind of like, you got you got him, we were hunting for this guy. And then, as I've grown up and everything, I serve at my church in the youth group up until the pandemic. I served in the same youth group that I grew up in, from middle school on up. And I've kind of become disenfranchised with it a little bit, not going to lie. Because I don't think that it actually builds a relationship for the most part with God. It builds a relationship with the people around you. And then when you all go off to different colleges, it shatters for everyone. And the same kids who I knew, the only ones that still go to church over here are pastors and actually now work at the church or pretty much have faded away. Like everyone else has pretty much faded away. So and that's a pretty big mega church. And it's just, I don't know how to fix that. I think it was too focused on butts and seats and not on, let's actually make sure they have a relationship with Jesus first. And it was just focused on numbers. It was a lot of focusing on numbers, and that at the end of the day, you can slip through the cracks and no one will even notice you're gone. So I don't know how to fix it.
I think Jason's experience is really indicative of what a lot of people experience. I, like Jason, I didn't enter into the pipeline as a kid necessarily. I stepped into church youth ministry when I was 16 years old. And my immediate thing was, this is really weird. And although there were great people there and I had a wonderful youth pastor, it wasn't preparing me to live as a Christian in the world. It was preparing me to live within the pipeline. And if you ever left the pipeline, good luck to you, because they had no way of helping you. So when I went off to a secular university, like, people were consoling my mom in the church foyer when they found out, because they thought, he's lost to the world. It's over. And she wasn't mourning it. She wasn't worried about it, but they were, because, oh my gosh, he left the pipeline. And that's, I think, the problem is, the pipeline may have been safe, but the internet was always going to demolish it. And if it didn't actually establish kids in a relationship with Christ, and it didn't equip them to live that life in the world, what good is the pipeline? Finally, back to the mailbag question, we do have an interview scheduled for later this summer, a little preview with Kara Powell, who is an expert on these issues from the Fuller Youth Institute. They've done a lot of data and research about kids in the church and teenagers especially. So if you want like an actual qualified expert backed by data, you have to stay tuned for that interview. And we've done some interviews with her in the past and some of the other books that they've done based on their studies. But I'm certainly no expert on raising kids. You could ask my three, they would tell you.
What are you talking about? If you're not the expert, Sky, who is? Sky, come on. Christian and I were in the generation that grew up with an intact pipeline and then watched it shatter around our own children.
That's so true, Phil. Exactly.
Yeah. And so we are the ones that are like, pipeline gone. what do we do? Baby shrimp are spilling into the larger ocean full of evil and sharks. And we got to get them back together in some kind of a bucket and to carry them to the promised land, whatever that was. I don't remember. I think it was Bible college. So I still have a knee jerk, like when one of my cousins
I,
says, I'm going to a state school. I'm like, oh no, oh, sharks. Oh, no
I
sharks.
have a funny story, Phil, because I have a vivid memory of Lisa and I having breakfast sometime and us talking about what was going on in our families. And this was a time where I think, your kids were having difficulty in youth group or going to church. And she said to me, Phil just thinks we're an unchristian family. He said to me, we're an unchristian family.
We're not doing it. We're not doing the thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so here's where I end up coming out of all of this is that if there's no industrial complex, if there's no, it's like social welfare systems in Scandinavia. If there's no cradle to grave, the government, quote unquote, will keep passing you along to the next adult to try to hold you into this semi-artificial position of being a follower of Christ. Parents just have to live it. And if parents just live it, their kids will find it compelling once they're done rebelling against it, which they will also do, because you don't just want to assume your parents are right. And for a season of your childhood, you will want to assume your parents are wrong. Once you're done assuming that your parents are wrong, you'll remember how compelling it was, what they were living out in front of you. But that actually means you have to live it. You can't just, I haven't figured this out and I don't know that I ever will. Good thing my youth group will teach my kids how it works. I don't have it. No, we need to have a clue. So we have to do the work to figure this out and then live it. And living it, I think, is much more impactful than saying it. But the modeling for our kids of what does it look like? And there has to be a form of activism that is different than simply church activity, because the activism of my youth was just activity. We were at the church all the time doing lots of things. Most of them were socializing things, not anything that Jesus lists in Matthew 25, not really anything about our neighbors, because we were all scared the heck of our neighbors. So we need a different form of Christianity. I was thinking about the crashing of this pipeline, and the scene, and I forget which Star Wars movie, is where two of like the biggest star cruisers, where they disable the little radar dishes on top so they can't steer them anymore, and one of the biggest star cruisers smashes into another of the biggest star cruisers, but it's like they're so big that it's really slow motion. Or maybe it's where he drives right into the Death Star. I don't know. Some big star cruiser collides with something else. And it's like, because it's so big, the people in the bridge could still say, hey, maybe we can turn. But it's already too late. It's already too late because it's just slow motion crumbling. And that's this pipeline. I just see it as like an Imperial Star Cruiser, not meaning that it was evil, but, it maybe wasn't fantastic. But it's so big and crashing in such slow motion that no, there is no finding a better youth group model and then hoping that it can pick up the pieces of what we've lost, and it's just us living in community and showing it to our kids.
That's go ahead, Christian.
No, I want you to go ahead, but then I would love to have a turn.
Apart from the very graphic Star Cruiser crashing into the Death Star thing, I had a much simpler metaphor.
No. It has to be Star Wars.
The pipeline to me feels a little bit like the walkway, the moving walkway at the airport terminal, where you can just stand there and it carries you along.
Not Star Wars.
No, it's not Star Wars. And that's sort of like how it existed when I was a kid, certainly when you guys were teenagers and kids, like you just stood there and it would take you along and you didn't have to do anything. And for my kids, it feels like that moving walkway is either non-existent or it's stopped. And so if they are going to
Yeah.
move in their faith, they actually have to want to move. They have to choose to do it. Now, I want to come alongside them, certainly, and encourage them and walk alongside them. But if they don't want to walk on it, there is no cultural pipeline or walkway that's just going to naturally carry them along. That's scary for some parents, but the upside is when they take a step, you know it's because they want to take a step. And I don't want to put my oldest daughter on the spot here, but like she went away to college this last year. She went to her alma mater, my alma mater, I should say. So I knew the environment, and she had her fits and starts and struggles and adaptations. It's COVID, it's all the craziness of this year, and then being a freshman. And it was gratifying that by her second semester, she made the choice to join a women's Bible study with a bunch of other girls and seek a mentor and get in. And like she did that all on her own in an environment where there was no conveyor belt that said, this is what you do. And the fact that she chose to do that means far more to me than if she had just been in a system that said, here's your mandatory discipleship group that you now need to be a part of because you're enrolled in this university and we go to chapel 3 days a week or whatever. I'm not saying that's bad for all kids, but at some point, even if you're in the pseudo pipeline or on this moving walkway, at some point it will end. Like Jason said, it ended for a lot of students when they graduate and go off to college, and then it all fell apart. So even if you have a walkway, you still got to teach these kids to walk. You have to teach them that it's not always going to be a moving floor under your feet, and you have to take the steps on your own. And in some ways, it's a sad thing that the pipeline's broken, but I'm not sure. I think it was inhibiting our development to a degree. And now we're seeing what was really there all along. All these atrophied legs that can't stand up and walk on their own.
I think. Oh, that's a good image. Little Wally there, little Wally.
Right.
The child evangelical pipeline was like those little floating easy chairs in Wally with the super big gulp holders.
Christian wanted to jump in and do something.
Oh yeah, Christian. Yeah, go.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say a couple things. I do think as I look back on my own raising of my children, and now I have a sister 18 years younger than I am, and she has little children now, my mind is trying to process that same question that many people are trying to process. What as parents can we do, and how do we spiritually train up a child in the way that they should go? And I think you both have very good points, but I do think as adults, we need some retraining. Only in my middle years, have I really worked hard to figure out how to walk with God, what that looked like to commune with him on a daily, basis. And starting that myself, like you said, Phil, and modeling that with many different things, the way I serve others, or the way that I talk about politics, or the way that I have, set aside time in the mornings to read my Bible, or the things that I read or consume that are sitting on my side table. I mean, I think those are all small little ways. Having your children come and serve with you or help others in a certain way. They see what you do. And we do have to become that change that we want to see in our own children spiritually. And I think, we need ways to teach little children who God is, instead of just reading them the same Bible stories in the same way that we know, may not be actually scripturally true. That's a challenge. And I think we need to have a lot less fear. I think letting our kids make mistakes and interact with the world, and being there to walk alongside them with the truth of the gospel and the way to make wise choices, is parenting them along the way with a scriptural framework, instead of forcing them to be in this pipeline and expecting certain behaviors. We have to look at their spiritual development outside of, don't drink, don't smoke, don't have sex, don't do all these things, and be a good Christian by going to youth group. It just needs to be a much broader and deeper than that. And I think that's going to take hard effort to try to figure those things out. There's not a manual that they were born with, and our old playbook has now been thrown out.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the pipeline that I was born into did not exist in the first century church. It was something we created way, way, way later, and that people seem to get along without it and raise children that sometimes followed the faith of their parents and sometimes didn't, exactly as was the case when the pipeline was fully enforced. So I think if you have, say you have 23 children and all of them become evangelical Christians just like you, I'm not sure if you've actually raised adults. I'm not sure what's happened there, and then you find out that some of them might be abusers and also evangelical Christians through your pipeline. Maybe the pipeline isn't so hot. Yes, Guy?
Can I add one last thing here? With or without a pipeline, with or without all these great programs and youth ministries and stuff like that, I think what is required is certainly the parenting aspects that you guys have been talking about, but they also need a broader community. They need to see we all know that teenagers think their parents are idiots, regardless of who they are. And so I think it was Gordon Smith who did this study. He had all these students over the years that he was a professor, and he would ask them to write their faith story for an assignment. He collected these over decades. And one of the things he found was that the most influential people in a young adult's life regarding their faith was not a parent, but a peer of their parents. So somebody, their parents' generation, with whom they had a relationship and trusted. So to have other people in our kids' lives who are also walking, you may not have the walkway that carries them along, but if there's a whole group of people that are walking in the right direction and they're amidst with them, that helps a lot. So I don't want to in any way diminish the importance of community or the church or the faith. It's just what it looks like is going to have to change and be much more relational.
Community less, captive pipeline, maybe not so much.
Right.
Is that what we're saying? Okay, Sky, do we have a guest? And
yes,
is it
we
you
do.
Again? Because if it's you again, I'm not even sure what I'm going to say.
No.
Okay.
It is not me again. One and done.
But Sky's book is out. What if Jesus was serious about prayer? Go buy it, review it, rate it, kiss it, take selfies with it in beautiful locations and put them on Instagram. Christian's movie is also out, The Girl Who Wore Freedom, on iTunes. Go to iTunes. And Apple TV. Go to iTunes, go to Apple TV, buy it, rate it, kiss it, take a picture of it, tweet
review it.
Well, review it, yeah. Unless you don't like it, then shut the heck up. Okay, no, you like it. You like it even if you don't, because that's community.
How about the only people who don't like the movie are Nazis?
Oh, was that your review, Sky? Was that the review? That's actually what I said about your book, ironically.
By the way, Sky, you did review my movie on iTunes, and I really appreciate that. You gave a great review, and that meant a lot to me.
I was happy to do it.
All right, guys, here comes the guest. Do not stop listening unless you're breaking it into two halves to listen on different days. That's okay. We approve of that, but you have to listen to the guest. It's a whole package, or I worry about your eternal soul. And we'll cover that topic next week. Okay, thanks, y'all. See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Today's episode is being brought to you by you. Well, at least those of you who are Patreon supporters of The Holy Post. You make our show possible, and we can't thank you enough. Thanks to our Patreon supporters, we're also able to expand into other shows like the movie proposal that I do with Josh Lindsay. And we have special projects coming up like the special sub-series of Jesus and John Wayne, where I interview historian Kristen Dumais about her book and how we can understand the current evangelical moment through our understanding of history. That'll be coming out soon, and we're going to release it to our Patreon supporters first. So if you're not yet a Patreon supporter, now's a great time to check out becoming one. For just $5 a month, you'll get access to bonus interviews with our incredible guests, and for $10 a month, you can join me, Phil, and Christian for our monthly live stream where we talk unfiltered and directly with you, our Patreon supporters, answering your questions about anything and everything. It's a ton of fun, and I think you'd love to be a part of it. So go to holypost.com and hit the Support Us link to learn more about how you can become a true Holy Poster by supporting us through Patreon. One of the more common questions I get from Holy Post listeners is, where do I get my news from? I think they're just curious where Phil and I get our information that ends up coming out on this show, and frankly, I often don't have a very simple answer for them, and that's kind of frustrating because we're overwhelmed today with information from cable news and social media and all the different online sources that we are bombarded with all day long. And that's one of the reasons I was really happy to have Jeff Bilbro join me on the podcast today. He is an associate professor of English at Grove City College and the author of a new book called Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news. He draws from his understanding of literature and history to explain how formative our news consumption can be, the way it shapes our imagination and actually competes with the church and the gospel to frame how we live in the world. I really enjoyed talking to Jeff Bilbro, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation as he offers some good insights into ways to be shaped by the gospel rather than by the popular news media. Here is my conversation with Jeff Bilbro. Jeff Bilbro, welcome to the Holy Post. So glad you could join us.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
Where are you coming from today, by the way?
I am in Spring Arbor, Michigan.
All right, is that home?
Well, yeah, we're in the process of moving. So I've been at Spring Arbor University for about 8 years, and this summer we're moving out to Grove City. So I started a new job at Grove City College this fall.
Oh, well, congratulations on the change. I hope it's a positive one. Okay, so you've written this book called Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news. And when I first came across the book, I immediately thought we got to have you on the show. And here's why. I get a lot of listeners to our podcast contacting me asking about news consumption because they're always asking me and Phil, where do you guys go for your news? How do you get your news? Why aren't you falling into the same traps or biases that we see in other places? And I don't know that we're not, but I don't have a great response to them other than I've tried to encourage people to read your news instead of watch it and avoid social media as a source. And that's about as far as I can go with them. But you've given a heck of a lot more thought to this than most people. So to start off with, what got you into this topic? Because when I looked at the other stuff you've written, it didn't seem natural to me that you would go into this topic. I mean, you talked about Wendell Berry and a lot of other kind of, not media consumption necessarily, although I guess there's some connections there. But what led you to this topic?
Yeah, well, first, your pieces of advice are pretty good. But yeah, I admit that it is kind of an odd topic for me and my background. I guess the way that I explain it is twofold. One, I've been interested in Barry for a long time, and issues of community, I guess, and place, and how the modern society and technology is changing the conditions for community and changing the kinds of communities that we can form. So kind of going from Barry's thinking about community to then shifting to look at digital technologies and how that's altering community. And then the other thread for me is that I've been working for 10 years or more on a long book project that's still in the works, still in the early stages, but about the shifts in technology in 19th century America with the telegraph, with steam-powered printing, with the early forms of photography, with new paper technologies. The paper became cheaper. And you see a lot of the same kind of misinformation and kind of information overload that we experience today in a digital context. You see those first crop up, I think, in the 19th century with the proliferation of cheap print and penny newspapers and sensational news. So I've been working on that for a long time. And speaking of social media, somebody on Twitter suggested that Christians needed a book about how to read the news well. And I thought, all these things I've been mulling over for a while, I could kind of bring together into this book project.
Well, it's interesting to go to the 19th century to help explain 21st century dynamics, but it's hard to imagine the telegraph and paper being the technology that overwhelms people with information. But I suppose it's all relative, right?
It is relative. I mean, you're right on the one hand, but there's a lot of sort of firsthand experience quotes in the 19th century where people are like, back when I was a kid, we read slowly and carefully, and now people are just skimming stuff and not even engaging with it. And, a lot of the kind of complaints about today sure seem to echo what I read in 19th century discourse. So you're right that it's very different, but there are some parallels.
So does that give us hope that we will acclimate to this new technological reality and reach some kind of normalcy, or is it more dire than that when you compare these two eras? What's your conclusion?
Yeah, well, I'm still working on that because it's tough. But I do think that gives us some hope, and maybe acclimate's a fair word and a fair idea. As individuals, we kind of reach a new equilibrium. But also, I think what you saw in the 19th century was the need for new institutions and new practices to develop around filtering information and kind of specifying or helping people understand what's quality information and what's quack, what's not good. So I'm hoping that we'll get better institutions and better kind of cultural practices that will help us navigate what's currently a pretty chaotic media ecosystem.
Okay, getting into that, you in one section of your book, you talk about attending to our attention. And you borrow a term from Thoreau where he mentions macadamized intellect. What on earth is that, and how does it relate to our media consumption today?
Yeah, so Thoreau is talking about his own sense of information overload and not knowing what's important to attend to and what's just trivial. And he says that if we perpetually attend to, the equivalent of a social media feed, then our minds can be permanently macadamized. And that's a reference to a relatively new, at that point, road construction technology, whereby it used to be roads were built with successively smaller building materials. So at the bottom, you would do big blocks of stone, and then you would work your way to smaller blocks. And this Scottish engineer thought, and discovered was true, that it would be better if you just use very small stones all the way through. This would withstand freezing better and withstand heavy carts better. So when you build a macadam road, nothing big. There are no big pieces. It's all small stuff. And Thoreau is worried that when you attend to trivia, you don't have any sort of mental anchors, mental commitments, and your mind is just filled with little tidbits, little bits of trivia. And so it actually, changes the way that you think. And of course, a lot of recent studies on neurobiology have supported Thoreau's argument that our patterns of attention can change the neurological structures of our brains and change the way that we think. So I think Thoreau's metaphor is kind of weird, but also maybe helpful.
So this results in, as you put, a lot of trivial knowledge, but no cohesive framework to understand it all. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, no cohesive framework, and maybe also no sort of clear fundamental commitments. So one of the things that Thoreau talks about is if your mind has been thoroughly macadamized, it's hard for you to critique and resist any sort of headline or slogan or advertisement or whatever that smart people send spinning down the highways of your mind. So it's harder for us to think, well, because I believe X, Y, and Z, I'm critical or skeptical of this new claim about this technology or this political proposal or this headline. And instead, we are more prone to just be outraged and kind of respond emotionally to all the crazy things that we read about each day.
So one of the deterrents to this or solutions to this you draw from Pascal, which I love this term. I'm not into Latin, but it's fantastic. Sancta indifferentia. Holy apathy, for those who don't know Latin. Holy apathy. It seems like we live in a moment, especially in the church, where we're trying to call people out of apathy all the time. There's all this activism towards engagement with all these different issues. And yet you think more apathy might be the solution? Explain what that means.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That sometimes, in the church, but also, of course, in the broader culture, there is such a focus on activism right now, and yet and that's nothing against redeeming culture and trying to be God's agents of redemption and creation, but too often I think that we can get all emotionally invested in the activist thing of the day. And our work maybe is not actually that helpful. It's one thing to post stuff on Twitter or social media or to get involved for a few weeks in some issue. But Pascal's notion of holy apathy, I think, is helpful in that he is enjoining us to not care as much about the outcome of our efforts and to hope that that kind of emotional detachment will free us to be faithful over the long haul to the good work we're called to do. So Pascal is not saying, don't be involved in issues of the day, don't be involved in controversies. He is saying God's providence is going to prevail. And so we shouldn't be too worried if it seems like our side is losing or winning, or if, we shouldn't be too worried about the outcome of our efforts. Instead, we should be faithful to obey what God's calling us to do today, and to be committed to the long haul and not flame out when we hit a roadblock.
It sounds like it would be closely related to the more Protestant or Reformed theology of vocation, where you can't possibly care about everything. So what is God calling you specifically to engage in, whether that's as simple as your family or household, your community, or your work, whatever it might. You can't look at everything that's coming across your screen all day long and going, I need to give equal attention to all of these broken realities of the world. One of the things that drives me up the wall, I hear this all the time, both from older Christians and younger Christians, but I just want to throw up a little bit in my mouth every time I hear it, is we should care about the things God cares about, or the things that breaks God's heart should break our heart. And I want to say, what part of the cosmos does he not care about? Because what it sounds to me like you're trying to say is, you should really care about what I care about, because I think what I care about is what's most important to God. It's a little bit reverse psychology going on. But we have to prioritize in some way, and that has to come from a sense of calling, so that we know what to give our attention to and what not to give our attention to. Which seems really unpopular right now, to tell somebody, hey, that's great what you're focused on, God bless you, but I don't have attention for that right now. That it feels offensive to say that to somebody. So how do you engage in holy apathy without basically getting the rage and anger of everybody around you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you're exactly right, and that this rich doctrine of vocation is helpful here. And I guess maybe what I would say in conjunction is just the need to recover an ecclesiology that recognizes that the body of Christ has many members. And some people, I am so grateful for Christians doing all kinds of work in all kinds of areas that I just don't have the gifting or scope, to attend to. And that's great. And I hope that other members of the church are grateful for the work that I do, and that we can celebrate the ways that God is calling different members of the body to attend and to work, without thinking that everyone has to be 100% invested in the work that I have been called to do. So I think, celebrating the diverse giftings of the church is at least one way to start.
Okay, let's turn the corner. Another section in your book, you talk about time, and you distinguish between two different visions of time, essentially, kairos and chronos. These Greek concepts, basically. Define those for us and how they manifest in our current media environment.
Yeah, so chronos refers to just the regular notion of time as duration, or as succession. One thing happens after another. It's now 2001. It's a particular year. And the news obviously privileges chronos, because in some ways what is news is what is happening right now. That's the unifying feature of all the crazy things that come under that heading. And kairos refers to a more cyclical or patterned notion of time. Maybe seasonal time. It's the right time to plant now because it's spring. It is also the sort of patterning of the liturgical calendar, the church calendar, which is patterned on the kairos drama, I guess, of God's engagement with creation. And so part of what I'm trying to do in that chapter is explain maybe why our culture has come to privilege chronos so much. And that's part of why I think we overvalue what's happening right now. And to think about, not just ignoring chronos, not just ignoring what's happening now, but rather trying to understand the events of today in light of the broader pattern of God's engagement with his creation. So trying to strike that balance that I think we see in the scripture between the kairos mode of time and the chronos mode of time.
It seems like in a consumer society like our own, what is new is always inherently more valuable than what's old. And if we want to feel valuable, then we need to be on board or up to date with what's new, the chronos kind of latest events, latest trends, latest products, whatever it might be, which lends itself then to the narrative that we hear a lot, which is you need to get on the right side of history. And if you're not up to date on the newest way of thinking about subject X, then you're backwards or you're antiquated or what's the danger in that, especially when it's unmoored from a grounded Christian understanding of time?
Yeah. I guess if there's one thing that I hope this book does is it helps people throw around that phrase, the right side of history, a little bit less often. Yeah, I mean, I think we can, and I think you're exactly right to tie it to consumerism and to a technological culture that depends for its continuation on always having this new, best, innovative product that you need to buy and throw away the old. And I think Christians should try to judge events, morality, not on the basis of whether something is new and whether something represents a break from the past, but rather whether something, as far as we can see, aligns with the pattern of God's relation with people, with creation. So certainly, some things that are new are great, and maybe they are instances of God, undoing oppression or breaking down evil systems, and that should be celebrated. But just because something is new does not mean that it's inherently better. And sometimes the old was better in a particular instance. So just trying to learn how to judge the events of time and the events of our day with how they might fit into God's ongoing and long history of relating to his people.
Okay, so that brings up one of the more interesting elements of your book, which it felt to me like so much of what you're advocating here is not necessarily dramatic changes in the way we read or consume the news, as much as it is a dramatic focus on our own grounding in our faith, in our community of faith, and in being formed in the gospel. That if those things are happening well, it will impact the way we read and engage and understand the news. Amen. I totally agree with you. Here's the problem. There's a lot of data out there that's saying our churches aren't doing a very good job of forming people in the gospel, in patterns of the cyclical seasons of liturgy, and establishing deep within us a knowledge of God's engagement with the world and with it. So if we're not doing that well within our churches, is there any hope that we're not going to be taken in by the false narratives of media and news and all the other craziness that you outlined?
Scott, it's a tough question. Yeah, I mean, I think yes. And I guess maybe part of my answer is we shouldn't expect there to be some kind of technological or sociological fix for our current dysfunctions in the media ecosystem. Like fake news and misinformation and and partisan politics and these kinds of things are symptomatic. And if we try to solve them with a new app or a new whatever, that's not really going to be effective. And yeah, I think in some ways one of the things they're symptomatic of is a lack of robust spiritual formation into the gospel and the liturgies of the church and the patterns of the Christian imagination. So the problems run deep. And I guess, if someone reads this book and thinks, oh, I need to invest in my local church and be more formed by that community, hey, that's great. So I hope that I give some ways that individuals and small communities can work on the problem, but I also don't want to pretend like there's a real solution to this problem outside of more holistic and formative Christian practices.
Yeah, it's always disappointing when we interview somebody who tells us that the solution is church and the gospel and deep formation in a spiritual life with Christ and his people, because that's hard.
Yeah, it's not.
And-
You can't sell a product on that, right?
Exactly. Okay. You have a quote in the book. You said, modern news organizations double as lifestyle brands where we get our news, signals, and shapes our identity. Okay. When I saw that, what jumped to my head was a recent interview I heard with Ryan Burge. And I don't know if you know who Ryan is, but he's a sociology professor and a pastor. I think he's at Eastern Illinois University. He was on the 538 Politics podcast, and he's done tons of research and data on the religious landscape in America and evangelicals in particular. And one thing he said on the podcast was that the label evangelical no longer has any real spiritual or theological definition, that it has merely become a lifestyle brand, which is synonymous with white conservative Republican politics. So when I hear him say evangelical is just a lifestyle brand, and I hear you say that news organizations essentially are lifestyle brands, is it fair to say that our news consumption or the outlets that we get them function as false, like alternative churches for us that give us a sense of belonging and identity? And should we be worried about that as Christian leaders, perhaps?
Yes, and yes, and again, the solutions are tough, right? But I think, yeah, as you see this in the breakdown of, say, denominational identity too, right? That fewer people identify with a particular denomination or a particular local church, and so we have to find our kind of belonging. Like, here, what's my tribe? What's my group? Other places, and oftentimes one of those places is, well, I am a consumer of X website or X TV station. And I think to one extent, I want to say that's a problem and we should find our identity more in the local church. To another extent, I do think that there's possibilities for, more healthy, formative online communities that can guide us as we seek to navigate the events of the day and help us sift and discern what's important and how we should feel about things. So, maybe ideally the solution would be invest more in your local church. But I do think there's also a place for healthy engagement with, from Christians in these spaces where, it can be a particular publication that really helps its readers and commentators orient themselves rightly to what's going on, or it can be private Facebook or other platform chats where people are able to kind of dialogue with each other and try to figure out what's going on, or share stories and share information. So on the one hand, I think it's a problem, that the whole setup is a problem. On the other hand, I don't want to just say we're kind of stuck with the problem, right? So the question then is, how do we navigate it in a more healthy manner?
Okay, so to play devil's advocate with you
Sure.
for a second, challenge just a second. Michelle Margolis wrote a book not too long ago, From the Pew to the Pulpit, which basically argued that people are increasingly making their church community choices based on their politics, rather than choosing their politics based on their church formation or religious beliefs. And to that end, and going back to the lifestyle brand idea of evangelicalism and the news media, it seems like in a lot of our churches, the people there are all homogenized because they all listen to Fox News, or they're all CNN, or they're all liberal progressives, or they're all white conservative Republicans. So what formative power are we expecting these communities, these Christian communities, to have on us if they're more shaped by the news media they're consuming than they are by the gospel? Does that make sense? Like I'm worried we're in a cyclical catch-22 where you're saying we should be more engaged in our local church, but what if our local church is actually shaped more by popular media than by the gospel?
Yeah, that is a huge problem, right? And I think one of the things about publishing this book has been the opportunity to talk to a lot of people, like podcast hosts and the people about this. And it is interesting. Every time I talk to a pastor, that issue comes up. Like my congregation is catechized more by Fox News or NPR or whatever than they are by the Bible and by my preaching. And part of that is the amount of time that they spend in church versus the amount of time that they consume news.
Right.
And part of it is just the broader cultural landscape and what you said about people self-selecting into churches based on their pre-existing politics. So yeah, I mean, the problems run deep. And that's why I do think there's a need for and a space for sane, Christian-formed community online that can hopefully build trust among the people who read the publication or participate in the comments. And but not, obviously a lot of online communities can be really toxic and can be really sort of reinforcing of whatever extreme views the people who find them already hold. So in response to that, some people advocate for kind of objectivity and fact checking and just neutral news. And I think, well, that's not really going to work. Maybe the response to bad online communities is good online communities. And we shouldn't necessarily try to be neutral or objective, but we should try to challenge each other and help each other think well about, issues of church and culture or whatever the issues are that we are most called to be concerned with.
There's no doubt that Wendell Berry's influence is felt in this book, as I would expect from you. Talk a little bit about that, because at various moments you call us to disconnect, to turn off Netflix, to quietly do the dishes, go for a walk, comes up. What is the formative power of those disconnections that we need to incorporate more into our regular lives? Yeah,
I mean, obviously, Berry is well known for his essay, Why I'm Not Going to Buy a Computer, and he still hasn't. So, he is quite disconnected. But I've also really been encouraged or helped by the work of folks like Andy Crouch in his book, Tech-Wise Family. And he, I think, lays out a pretty helpful set of rhythms, I guess, ways of taking the Sabbath off the internet. Or he is quite strict about taking a couple weeks off in the summer. And I think we have to not think that we as individuals are immune to the formative pressures of social media and the internet. And so, in my own life, I do follow more or less some of the things that Andy talks about. I also don't own a smartphone, and that's been a helpful barrier, I guess. I think we just need to be more deliberate as individuals, but especially as families and churches, hopefully, about helping each other not feel the need to be connected all the time, and to take a step back and to rest, to remind ourselves of the broader communities that we're part of, and that we're not just the avatar on a particular social media feed that represents us, but that we are members of local places and local churches and families.
I remember years ago, I think I've told this story on the show before, I took my daughter to camp for a week. She went to a Young Life camp, actually, in Michigan, probably not far from where you are. And I went to pick her up and some of her friends, because they had to leave a day early, and they're not allowed to have their phones with them when they're at camp for the week. And so their camp counselor came out with a backpack and opened it up, and the girls' phones were there, and they could take them, have them back, and head home. And they all paused when the backpack was opened, and they just stared at their phones. And I asked them, what's the problem? And one of the girls said, I don't know if I want it back. Because they had such an impactful week together, really connecting, I think, with each other on a human level, and hopefully with God. And they realized that the moment they took that phone back, it was back to the rat race of social media and engagement and the frenetic formation that happens with those devices. And Andy has a ton of wisdom on this, and I recommend his book as well. And I know it's going to look different in different families and communities, but the basic principle that we need regular rhythms of disconnection from media in order to connect with each other and God is true, I think, for all of us. And that's what your book helps us get to as well. Final question. What, if you could give people one bit of advice regarding their media consumption and the first step they can take, let's say they're a typical American, completely saturated with and bombarded by these things all the time, with the macadamized intellect and and everything that goes with that. What would be your first step, the first bit of detox that you would walk somebody through as you begin to wean them off of that media consumption?
Wow, good question. I'm not sure anyone's asked me that yet. I guess, I try to give some practices or some places to start throughout the book. And maybe the two easiest ones are things like take a walk, just walk through your neighborhood. And, some people do live in pretty homogenous or sort of buffered neighborhoods, but a lot of people live in neighborhoods among people whom they probably do not share the same sort of media outlets, right? It's quite like that if you walk down your street and through your local part of town, you'll have a chance to rub shoulders with people who watch different TV stations or read different outlets. And I think kind of learning to attend and consider and prayerfully imagine, what are the events of today that matter to these people? And are they the same events that I'm outraged about? That's maybe one. And then maybe just to sort of highlight what you said earlier about the need for rhythms of disconnection. I thought it was interesting last spring as COVID forced us all online, how many people rediscovered the benefits of some kind of physical craft or activity. Like baking bread was incredibly popular.
Yeah.
Or gardening or, doing something with your body. And I think those can be really helpful in terms of forming long, careful attention. You are directly responsible for baking that bread well. And if you mess up, there'll be results. So not just sort of consuming passively all these terrible things, but actively engaging in creation and actively doing something, taking responsibility. And hopefully that forms us then to think about the tragedies or issues that we read in the news the same way, not just as things to emotionally consume, but as events which may provoke us, may call us to take action and to be responsive to.
Great advice. Well, Jeff Bilbro, this book, Reading the Times, you are tapping into what I consider to be the most critical discipleship question of our era. And the future of the church in North America and the future of our culture is hinging on these issues of technology and media. And I think in the last number of years, we've seen the power that it can have, whether we're talking about the COVID pandemic and the false information that's out there, the politics, and a lot of the nuttiness that's going on in much of the American church is the product of what you're talking about. So having your wisdom and the literary and historical insights that you provide are amazingly helpful. So I can't recommend this enough to everyone, but especially those who have some responsibility for others, a pastor, professor, teacher, parent. Incredibly helpful stuff. So thank you so much for the work that went into the book and for giving us this resource. Appreciate it deeply.
Well, thanks very much, Sky. I appreciate that.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.